My first guest tonight is a very Welshman. Born in the Rhondda Valley, the son of a miner, he became a teacher, novelist, playwright and television personality in that order. Ladies and gentlemen...
Gwyn Thomas was a man of many talents. As a talker, he was in a field of his own.
Gwyn, can I interrupt you? I thought this was supposed to be an interview, not a monologue.
Sorry.
As a writer, he brought a dark humour to the lives of the working masses.
Had I not found the kind of idiom that I needed, I might have gone through life silent. And many people, I'm sure, would have been overjoyed at this fact.
His comedy was rooted in the harsh reality of life in the Rhondda.
Now, this may sound like Dickensian melodrama, but Dickensian melodrama is the very stuff of this life.
Gwyn Thomas was born in Cummer in the Rhondda Valley in 1913. Gwyn's father, Walter Morgan Thomas, worked in the local colliery where he looked after the pit ponies. He and his wife, Zephora, lived at 196 High Street with their 12 children. Gwyn was the youngest of the bunch.
Our kitchen, about the size of an average hutch, was a busy bilingual bomb of a place. The first 6 children spoke Welsh, the bottom 6 English, and all at the same time. Politics in English, gossip in Welsh, and downright lies in both. This was probably the greatest bit of good fortune that a writer could ever have had, being the youngest of 12 children, and all marvelously gifted in their own ways, very garrulous, passionate, communicative, telling each other everything about themselves, arguing about every conceivable topic under the sun. And of course, being the youngest, I was the little gnome. I was the joker in the pack, you see. I could circulate among all the different rival groups in the kitchen.
Gwyn grew up in a busy, exciting world, full of dramatic characters. The Rhondda of his childhood was teeming with life. It was the most densely populated area of Britain, thanks to one industry.
This was the heart of our town, the yard of the colliery. They dug the hole, planted the pithead gear that carried the men to and from the surface, and the town grew up around it. A town's dark heart.
Life down the pit could be short and brutal. Gwyn's grandfather had survived an explosion underground only by climbing over the bodies of his dead father and brothers. Even in Gwyn's time, the pithead cast a long shadow over the life in Cummer.
In my boyhood, men would die in those days, and the coal owners wouldn't even afford an ambulance. The man was lifted onto a rough litter. His dead body would be covered by a sack, and the little cortege, this pathetic little procession of men, bearing their dead comrade to his home. No news having been given, of course, to the family. And they would start up the hillside. And we in our beds, up there, in the village, would hear the first sounds of these feet. We would listen for a few seconds. We would put on a few clothes and rush out. And the little procession would be passing the house. And we would fall in behind the procession. And this was the awful roulette that we would play in our imagination. Outside which house would that little procession stop? And of course it had to stop somewhere. And the poor thing, the poor dead thing, would be unloaded onto the poor, widowed threshold.
When he was just 6, Gwyn's mother died. Her hard work and good spirit had kept the Thomas household together.
My mother died when I was very, very young, but I've never lost the sense of belonging to her, this magnetic woman that I never truly knew. And it's manifested itself, of course, in this kind of geographical complex. I'm never happy unless I am in this county of Glamorgan.
After his mother's death, life became tougher for the Thomas family. Gwyn was a regular visitor at the local soup kitchens. But there was one escape from the daily struggle of life in the valley.
The hills were always a solace to the miners. This is where they came for peace, for a kind of serenity from the turbulence and the trouble of the valleys, and particularly to this place. It's a village called Llanwano, and it lies midway on the mountaintop between the Rhondda Valley and the Aberdare Valley. I know it intimately well because every Sunday of my childhood, my father would bring me here, walking up and across the plateau.
Gwyn recalled these trips up the mountain in his memoir, A Few Selected Exits, later dramatized for television.
You've got family at Mountain Ash?
We've got a family at home.
Not the sort of family you keep at home. I'm talking about aunts and cousins. They will see us coming down the hillside, and they will give you money. Tavern of the Fountain. We are now exactly halfway to Mountain Ash.
Is it a fountain?
There's a spring, and its water is sweet.
Good. I'm thirsty. Pubs don't open on a Sunday.
Now, you wait, yeah, and I'll bring you a lemonade, all right? Look, see? Got a lovely view of the cemetery.
Several times we started on that Sunday walk, but we never completed the journey to the neighbouring valley, where fair and benevolent women would shower us with threepenny bits and new dimensions of joy. After a session in the pub, my father would be too weary even to start on the second leg of the pilgrimage. He was a latter-day Moses who had mislaid his map.
Gwyn was a bright young lad who showed a talent for languages. At the age of 18, he won a scholarship to study Spanish at Oxford University. Gwyn claimed that he chose Spanish because he'd heard that Buenos Aires was top of the league for sin, sex, and sun. But he'd never been out of Wales, and for him, even Oxford was a complete culture shock.
I'd been brought up, you see, in this warm soup of comradeship, love, singing, understanding, because the South Wales Society was the most marvellously interpenetrating thing. Everybody seemed to be sensitive, you know, with a thin-skinned awareness of everybody else's problems. And you only had to change the look in your eye, and the expression of other people would instantly change. And then, you see, from the Rhondda Valley, without preparation, without ever having been to any other kind of place, any other kind of school, I went to Oxford, which was the most glacial, the most forbidding, the most remote place. It was like being taken to Nepal.
Gwyn's 3 years at Oxford were the unhappiest time of his life. Surrounded by the sons of the gentry, he was a fish out of water.
The effect of Oxford on me, you know, the son of an unemployed miner. I mean, there were thousands of people at Oxford whose fathers were unemployed, but I was the only one whose father was officially unemployed. He was on the books.
Gwyn's unhappiness and alienation did not go unnoticed by his tutors.
Confidentially, I should say that he is probably the most anxious problem in our department. Coming to Oxford has completely disorganised him mentally in a way that he would have been spared in a junior university. One knows he is clever and hard-working, but one can prophesy little about his future. There is always teaching.
At the end of his second year, Gwyn escaped Oxford to spend a term at Madrid University. That trip took him through the Asturias region of northern Spain.
There were times on that journey when I felt as if I was walking into villages in the Rhondda and the other South Wales mining valleys, because you had the same warmth, the same kindliness, but above all, the same marvelous intensity about these people.
They realized that they had been living intolerable lives for a long, long time, and tolerance was running out.
Within a year, Spain was engulfed in civil war, and Gwyn was back in the Rhondda. But there was no work there, even for an Oxford graduate. Britain was in the grip of a deep depression. Gwyn was moved by the events around him to write his first novel, Sorrow for Thy Sons. The comic spirit that would characterize his later work was absent from this first book.
The first novels that I wrote were so angry, so searing, so wild, that there was a legend that all publishers' readers in London who had to do with my manuscripts were equipped with firefighting equipment, asbestos underclothes and so on, which enabled them to read these books without undue discomfort.
Publisher Victor Gollancz rejected the book, but requested a meeting with its author. Gwyn travelled to London and had got as far as the stairs of the Gollancz offices when he suddenly had a panic attack. He turned and went home. The reading public would have to wait another 10 years to hear from Gwyn Thomas. Back in Cummer, he began courting family friend Lynn Thomas. The couple were married in Pontypridd Registry Office on the 5th of January 1938. When war broke out, Gwyn volunteered for the army, but having smoked heavily since the age of 10, he failed the physical. He found work as a teacher, first in West Wales and then at Barry County Boys' School. He brought his own unique style to the classroom.
There is something rather absurd, of course, about a domineering man with 30 captive children in a room, you know, teaching things which are going to be totally irrelevant to them for most of their lives. But I must say that I achieved a very good compromise most of the time. I mean, I didn't want to teach and they didn't want to be taught.
Gwyn's students nicknamed him Killer Thomas, thanks to his fondness for dressing in the style of a B-movie gangster. He enjoyed the company of pupils and staff and found in both a willing audience for his humour. He was liked and respected by all. Gwyn had not given up on his writing. Each day after school, he would sit down and work on a story. His writing showed a love of language and an eye for comic detail. He captured the world of his childhood in all its strange glory, in pieces such as The Santa Platoon.
It was the Christmas Eve singing that brought the full enchantment, that lifted the curse of shabbiness and inadequacy. Otherwise, that might have settled us for life. At the end of each carol, us boys would take gifts of fruit and nuts into the houses, and then the householder in turn would pour out a peg of vegetable wine for all who wanted it. Down went the stoops of parsnip, turnip, and elderberry moonshine. By the time the night was ended, men who for years had been steeped in austere and monkish habits would be flaring with resurgent desires, walking with the strutting puissance of Louis XIV, knocking on the doors of old lovers and chasing young ladies up the side streets, and playing havoc with the tempos of the carols.
As these stories began to mount up, Lynn saw in them a way of bringing some extra money into the house. She typed them up, bundled them into 3 parcels, and sent them off to 3 different publishing houses. To her surprise, all 3 were accepted. Gwyn's short novel, The Dark Philosophers, was published in 1946. It was followed swiftly by a second book and a collection of short stories. They were praised by the critics. Over the next decade, Gwyn combined teaching and writing, producing a book a year. His novels were well received, but they were never to become bestsellers.
I've not had much success, you know, in the recognizable sense of selling millions of copies of books. I've always had a very, very limited readership. I once defined my readership as being large enough to be accommodated in a reasonably sized catacomb or vestry.
In 1951, a BBC radio producer asked Gwyn if he'd considered writing for the radio. Searching for inspiration, Gwyn turned to his childhood memories of the miners' strike of 1926, when striking miners entertained themselves by marching through the streets with tin gazookas.
The first bands were what were called jazz bands. Quite misleading, of course, because they had nothing at all to do with New Orleans. They were simply men who dressed up in any bit of material that came to hand. They would cavort around in the most lunatic fashion. They didn't march properly. And, of course, men would dress as women and so on. They were anarchic vagabonds, really, just laughing at the whole phenomenon of struggle and the rest of it, and blowing into their gazookas and playing the fool. And a lot of people were dismayed by this, of course, because they didn't think that a strike, a general strike, was the occasion for this kind of buffoonery.
Mr. Chairman, since these bans came, decency has gone to the dogs. Oh, calm down. There is something about the sound of a drum that makes the average voter as brazen as a gong. The girls go up in droves to the hillsides where the bands practice, and there is some quality about these gazookas that makes the bandsmen so daring and thoughtless, you've got to dig if you want to find modesty anymore.
Gazooka was broadcast on BBC Radio to widespread acclaim. One reviewer wrote, "Dear Corporation, I implore you to give us more of Mr. Gwyn Thomas." BBC Radio commissioners were soon taking a great interest in this new talent, and a flurry of correspondence followed between London and Cardiff.
Subject Gwyn Thomas. You will have heard how appreciative our critics team was of Gazooka. Also, I have been reading one of his novels, which impresses and amuses me a good deal. Have you used him as a talker or a short story writer?
Thank you for your note of February the 6th. The current interest in our author is not only widespread throughout the BBC, but it has become an embarrassment to us. He's actually written scores of short stories.
I'm sorry to add to your embarrassment about him, but I am convinced from reading one of his books that he has a verbal ingenuity and humour. I am prepared to back him, provided he is a capable broadcaster, for a good placing in basic home service.
Gwyn was called for an audition. After 10 years of performing in front of his students, he took to radio like a duck to water. Over the next few years, he was a regular guest on panel shows such as The Brains Trust and Any Questions.
Can the team explain why a bunch of unattractive, unkempt youths bawling down a microphone can drive young girls to a frenzy?
I mean, this has created a kind of hysteria, but I don't think we should ignore what lies behind it. It is a great hunger for articulacy, for beauty, for being in the light. Because so many of these people, after all, are the first generation who have actually got their voices before the public. So don't let's criticize the quality of the sound they make at the moment. It is squalid, it is bestial, but in an appalled sort of way, I'm for it.
These panel shows made Gwyn a celebrity. The public appreciated his wit and his way with words. By the mid-50s, he was juggling his teaching work with his newfound career as a broadcaster and newspaper columnist. Dear Peter, I've got myself landed with a weekly column for the Welsh Empire News. What in God's name can a civilized man find to say at intervals of 7 days to the readers of a Sunday paper? And the stuff has to tie in with Welsh affairs. There isn't a Welsh affair in sight that isn't black and blue with polemical flogging. Never mind. I'm just over the page from Diana Dawes. So if you hear a swift tearing sound, you know what's going on. Or coming off. From the 60s on, television offered a new platform for Gwyn's talents. Producers were soon calling on him to comment on matters of grave national concern.
The
fish and chip shops of South Wales are running out of chips. To explain how Wales will stand up to this national calamity, this chip crisis, playwright and author Gwyn Thomas.
Well, it won't stand up, it'll sit down, I think. Because, I mean, we've taken such a number of beatings in our time, national identity lost, the language lost, a large part of the religion lost, but I think that we'll put on a Custer's last stand for the potato and the chip. Well, I would say the chip is the most polite and pleasant way of starving, of course, and we've been invited to starve on many occasions in our historical career. And the chip was a marvelous way of doing it, because the chip in itself, possibly without personality, but with salt, which kills, and vinegar, which apparently kills, was the perfect diet for us. It was the quickest way out.
Around the time that Gwyn was holding forth on the demise of the chip, he made his debut as a theatrical playwright. His play, The Keep, was premiered at London's Royal Court Theatre in 1961 and was later produced for television. It tells the story of a Valley's family in crisis.
You are a lot of cunning cripples. You stayed in the old home because of Mam, because of Con, because of me. Let me tell you why you stayed. Because you would never have had it so easy anywhere else. God, what a lot of moaners you've been. You, Russell, with your school and your lost genius. And you, Ozzy, with your ticket office and your coyer. And you, Alvin, with your tin plate works, signalling the red dawn every time some clumsy clown in that ramshackle dump drops something on himself and breaks a toe. You'll never leave here. You're part of the walls, like me. You've got nowhere else to go.
Gwyn followed up The Keep with the television play The Slip, about a scheming councillor who hopes to win votes thanks to a subsiding slag heap.
And why did you refuse the mayor's offer to have the top terrace people placed on the top priority housing list?
Well, our people are proud. They don't want to be indebted to the council.
You took them off the list so that you could promise the council houses to people lower down the slope. And you're hoping that by the time top terrace catches on to these manoeuvres, the mountain will silence them before they can get around to calling you a nuisance. You, Selwyn, are the only councillor who will live to see half his constituents bribed up to the hilt and the other half buried up to the neck.
Oh, 30 years from now, Dad, you'll be eating those words.
A good tenant goes down with his rent book. 10 years as a manager of a cinema in the early days, and I've got to see that custard tart routine in my own kitchen.
In these plays, Gwyn drew on the natural drama of life in the South Wales valleys.
You once said that every Welshman's a kind of mobile theatre. What exactly did you mean by that?
This is true. I mean, they have ways of telling you the time that make you think that they've invented the clock. It's 10 to 9. It's 10 to 9, they go. It's 10 to 9. I'm a liar. It's 5 to 9, you see. And in the Rhondda Valley, this was a very strange thing. This is a very strange thing. In the Rhondda Valley, I looked like thousands of other people. You know, slightly Semitic, slightly negroid, and dark and short, broad. And I must have looked like so many people that time and again, people have come up to me, you know, in the street, tug my sleeve. Braun's pregnant. I didn't know who Braun was. No idea.
In 1962, after 20 years in the classroom, Gwyn finally gave up teaching to become a full-time writer and broadcaster. He and Lynn settled in the quiet village of Peterston in the Vale of Glamorgan. He now earned his living from his pen, observing and commenting on the life of the Welsh nation in his work for television, radio, and the press. At the time, Wales was experiencing a reawakening of its national identity. But Gwyn had little time for nationalism.
I mean, the most magnificent crown of my community was that we were a fusion of thousands of people decanted from the English counties into Welsh valleys. And I mean, after all, the names in my class at the elementary school were names like Marsden, Mustow, Billington. as well as Jones and Evans and Thomas. So I would have been a rare old fool to have said, I will insist upon a purely Welsh identity. We really considered Welsh to be a kind of pet. It was lovely to have a few phrases, you know, and to know that there were Welsh bards and there were Eisteddfodic ceremonies and the rest, but a pet, something to be kept as a kind of domestic thing. And we would have said, well, all right, have a pet, but if a man ran his dog for mayor, it would have been considered an anomaly.
With the Welsh language movement going from strength to strength, Gwyn's views were bound to provoke a backlash.
I mean, after all, how great is the distance from nationalism of whatever kind, from the ghastly disease that came out of Germany.
Very,
This
very...
worship of far ancestors, of blood, of tradition. It is the most corrupt, demoralizing rubbish.
The English are the greatest nationalists of all.
Of course they
and
are.
they said that they fought Hitler for the cause of small nations. Well, they didn't protect Wales in the process, did they?
But in political terms, the great task of the British people in the last 80 years was to overcome British jingoism and imperialism.
Yes.
And the Welsh people made a massive contribution to this. All its great leaders put the bulls, daggers and horns into people like Kitchener and all the great Tory imperialist leaders. And now, in our own midst, we have something of the same kind happening.
In 1968, Gwyn published his memoir, A Few Selected Exits. Poet John Betjeman called it a wonderful book. It was later televised by the BBC, with Anthony Hopkins playing Gwyn.
There's enough wire in that studio to hang all of humanity. One day it might do just that.
Panofsky.
No, I'm not Panofsky.
I am Dr. Panofsky.
Oh, yes.
And you, I believe, are Dr. Glyn Daniel.
No, I'm Mr. Harry Siku.
I beg your pardon. Has there been a change of policy? As I understand it, Seacombe is a tenor and a comedian.
Thank you,
Now an accomplished author and household name, Gwyn had come a long way from the Rhondda of his childhood. Yet it had never truly left him. All his life he carried with him a keen memory of the injustices he'd witnessed in his youth. But his response was not anger. For Gwyn, the daily tragedies of human existence only made sense as comedy.
If I ever had any philosophy to pass on to other people, it would be this. Please do not regard any serious conception of yourself as having any truly valid meaning. We are all the victims of a great overriding joke.
Gwyn Thomas died on the 13th of April 1981. His ashes were scattered outside the Bryn Fannon Inn, the pub he used to walk to on a Sunday with his father.
Join Chris Corcoran in 10 minutes over on BBC One Wales as he presents a new episode of the quiz that's all about the valleys. Whose coat's that jacket?